Hello, I'm Icey, and welcome to my new book collection. They're gonna fall when until the book falls. So today, I am going to read Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud voice indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room, but loud tissue. When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. Well, technically, the bird is me. Well, technically, I do look like Big Bird. Crummy, those egats coming. Right, we'll continue. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the baker shop. Crash with the door as he opened it. Bang with the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread. Boom, Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled. It sold him a loaf. Egads, this isn't right. Just think about these crummy egads coming. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clup, clup, clup. He walked into the butcher shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat. Boom, Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered it in Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. What's the answer? I don't know. Maybe I'll just turn the page and see. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down to Wobbletown. Clop, clop, clop. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. I can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Those crummy egads, they don't think crazy. They don't know what they think about egads. I don't know. Maybe I'll just take... Okay. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat! Roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed hungry. Grit McGillicuddy. Do not talk about McGillicuddy. Oh man, no, it's night. Oh, this is a night. This is not a night for vaping calls, though. Where can I find the pot with a cock? Oh, those egads, they don't know. Okay, moving on. The day after Mr. Noisy tries again, he went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice, a loaf of, and then he stopped, and then he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Oh, certainly. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. I said I'd like that. And then he stopped, and then he stopped, and then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. He's not talking about egads. He's talking about some crummy stuff. Just think about it. Drink it. It's good. Oh man. Okay, these are the noisy shoes again. Those are deep. Okay. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. Clup, clup, clup. What a great sound. Then he stopped, and then he thought, and then you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped, and then he thought, and then you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things that Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. That is funny too. Great. I do know something. From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like noisy as he used to be. And you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. Okay, you can't talk about egads while reading this thing. And McGillicuddy. I also promised Mr. Noisy might be going to Bombay. And then you should positively go visit Snoopy at Woodstock on my channel. And think about the... And Mr. Noisy and Rolf the Dog, well, 1976 is my channel name. And technically, I thought you're going to put out... Good night. Oh. Puppies are not bad to buy. Do not talk about Grit McGillicuddy. Yeah. You